When she said, "You're not my father," it wasn't by screaming. It was worse than that. She spoke softly with that cold tone that cuts more than any scream, with her chin raised and her eyes full of a pride that I didn't recognize. We were in the living room of the house in Houston, the contract open on the coffee table, the pen already in her hand. I had stopped everything just to warn her of the giant mistake she was about to make, and instead of listening, she decided to hurt me. For a few seconds, I didn't even answer. I was silent, but inside me something screamed. It wasn't anger. It was a mixture of tiredness, disappointment, and a question that I couldn't silence. Where did I lose this bond? I looked at her and I no longer saw the 9-year-old girl who asked me for help with math in the kitchen. I saw a young adult ready to throw in the trash everything I tried to build, just to prove that she could decide on her own. And yet, I didn't raise my voice. At that moment, I stopped being the figure who tries to please everyone. At that moment, I stopped being a victim. I became an observer. I realized that I didn't need tone by shouting, that I didn't need to force anything. She thought those 4 words were going to demolish me, that I was going to back down, that I was going to apologize for warning me. Instead, I just leaned my back against the couch, crossed my arms, and let the silence work for me. I knew something she didn't know yet. This was not just any family quarrel. It was not a small drama of an angry stepdaughter. We were talking about an investment contract that a friend had put in front of her, an older, well-dressed guy who loved to present himself as a financial mentor to the younger ones. She met this guy at a conference in Austin, and he had been coming up to him, praising her, saying she was smarter than her mom and stepdad combined. It wasn't just flattery, it was bait. I recognized these kinds of people from afar. As the CFO of a logistics company, I spent half my life looking at numbers, clauses, risks hidden in small print. It wasn't hard to see the problem. It only took a closer look at the pages she dropped on the table for me to understand the size of the trap. Nothing in that contract protected her. It was basically a surrender of everything she had gathered, plus the responsibility for debts that didn't even exist yet. And it wasn't for lack of warning. I had already asked her to show me the documents before. She stalled. When I finally brought it, I already wanted to sign that same day. I tried to speak calmly. He said that she had the right to invest, to risk, to grow, but that she needed to understand what was at stake. I pointed out the clause that made it liable for future operating costs, with no clear limit. I showed the passage in which she waived the right to question the decisions of the so-called mentor. I asked her if she really trusted someone she had known for a few months, more than someone who paid for school, medicine, college, who stayed in the hospital when she had her first knee surgery. She didn't listen. Or rather, he even listened, but did not want to admit that I was right. I saw the conflict in her eyes. She knew those lines weren't clean. I knew there were things there that didn't match. But pride spoke louder. When I said that, if it was my signature, I would tear up that paper. It froze. He hardened his face, took a deep breath, and fired off the phrase, "You're not my father." It wasn't about the contract. It was about proving that she could hurt me. At that moment, everything inside the house seemed to get smaller. The television on with no sound in the background, the clock on the wall marking the end of the afternoon, the light coming in through the living room window. None of that mattered. What weighed was the distance that opened up between us. Years of birthdays, graduations, trips, baseball games that I watched from the stands. Everything shrank before that phrase. And yet, I didn't respond in kind. Instead of asking, "So who stayed awake when you had a fever?" I just took a breath and let her finish her speech. She continued. She said that I was trying to control her life, that I was afraid of seeing her grow up, that I didn't accept that she made decisions without my authorization. Words that I knew were not hers, at least not entirely. I recognized the vocabulary of that man. People who manipulate love to push this discourse of financial freedom, absolute independence, as if any care was prison. I listened quietly, almost as if he were in a board meeting watching a nervous shareholder vent frustration. They were in a hurry. I had the time. As she spoke, I remembered old conversations, the times when she arrived crying because a schoolmate humiliated her, and I sat with her in the garage, near the truck, to explain that her value did not depend on anyone's approval. I remembered the first time she jokingly called another guy dad in front of me, and then looked at me to see if I was jealous. I laughed and said that titles didn't matter to me. What mattered was to be present. But that evening, I realized that for her, the title was the perfect weapon. I could have knocked on the table, said that in that house I was the one who paid the bills, that the car she used had come out of my annual bonus, that the trips to New York, the exchanges, the extra courses, everything had gone through my approval and my card. I could have thrown every penny in her face, but I didn't. I realized that if I got into this game, I would lose more than money. He would miss the chance to show who was really acting with maturity. And deep down, I knew that life would take care of showing who was right. She ended her speech by saying that she was going to sign the contract with or without my approval. He picked up the pen again, holding it as if it were the sword that would prove his independence. I just leaned forward, rested my elbows on my knees, and spoke softly, almost in a warning tone, not a threatening. It's okay. You are an adult, you can sign whatever you want. Just remember one thing. When things go wrong, Theon, who really cares, is the one who is still here, even after hearing that he is not a father. She turned her face, feigning indifference, but her hand trembled for a second. I knew that contract was not going to disappear. I also knew that he was not as solid as the mentor made him seem. What she didn't realize is that, even before that conversation, I had already done what any experienced CFO would do. I researched the company, got the records, the processes, the financial reports that were not on the beautiful website or in the colorful presentations. They had greed. I had the documents, and it was only a matter of time before this came to light. She didn't notice, but when she got up from the table to get the phone and confirm the time she would meet the mentor, I had already seen everything I needed to see. Not from the conversation, but from her. The way she held the pen revealed insecurity. The way she looked away when I touched a clause showed that, deep down, she knew she was about to get into a hole. But admitting it meant accepting that I was right. And at that stage of her life, being right was worth more than being safe. As she walked down the hallway, I felt a weight in my chest. Not by me. I was already over 46. I had seen a lot of good people break because they trusted in easy promises. It was the risk of those who grow up within a society where haste is worth more than prudence. What really hurt was imagining that she, someone I'd treated as a daughter for so long, would be about to sign a contract that could ruin her own future, just to prove independence to someone who didn't even care about her. I sat there, watching the bedroom door close, and for a moment I thought about getting up and insisting once more. But I stopped. I realized that I didn't have to win by shouting. When she returned, she was already with her cell phone in her hand, talking loudly, laughing, demonstrating a confidence that was not entirely real. She said that the mentor was excited, that he had investors waiting for her signature, that it could put her on the map. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt. I just watched. I became an observer because I understood that sometimes the best way to communicate with someone who refuses to listen is to let the world do the work. She passed me by as if I were invisible. He collected the contract sheets in a hurry, as if he was afraid that I would touch them again. But as she gathered the papers, I noticed something that escaped her control. The manila envelope that accompanied the contract had a crooked label, with one registration number mixed with another. It seemed that someone had glued it in a hurry, and in that detail something lit up in my head. Serious documents do not come like this. They do not come crooked, erased, patched. Not in the American corporate world where every record has to be flawless to survive in a court of law. She didn't notice what I noticed, and when she put everything in her bag, she was already determined to leave. He said he was going to meet his mastermind at a coffee shop in Midtown, near where he said he was closing an investment round. The expression was enough for me to almost laugh alone. Serious people don't close a round in a coffee shop. It closes in an office with a team with a lawyer by your side. But I didn't say anything. She was no longer listening. It was like talking to someone who puts on headphones and turns up the volume just to drown out their voice. So I let her go. The door slammed. Silence filled the house. The room seemed larger but colder. I stood there, taking a deep breath, feeling that bitter taste that stays in your mouth when you see someone you love walking to a wall without realizing it. I turned on the television, but I didn't pay attention to anything. I went through the channels without really seeing what was happening. The mind was stuck on the same question. How can Agnon throw away years of care because of an empty compliment coming from a stranger? That's when my cell phone vibrated. A message from my coworker, a guy who works with me in the internal audit industry. I had asked him to take a look at that company and the system, just to confirm that it was really what it looked like. And the message camaraderie, direct, bluntly, the way experienced people talk, don't invest. Process opened, dirty history. Owner is prevented from registering a company in 2 states. The heart tightened. It was not surprising, but it was confirmation. I got up from the room, grabbed my jacket and the keys to the truck. I knew exactly where she was going, and I also knew that this meeting wasn't just a coffee shop to talk about numbers. It was the final blow. The moment when he would put pressure, he would say that without her signature, the opportunity would be lost. They were in a hurry. I had the time, but still I needed to be around, not to prevent it, but to prevent it from totally destroying itself. I hit the road to Midtown with my heart racing. Houston always looks bigger when you're worried. The traffic was heavy. The buildings reflected the late afternoon sun, and I could think of only one thing. How could someone so young believe so blindly in a stranger, and doubt so easily someone who had always been there? Maybe it was age, maybe it was influence, maybe it was pure pride, but it was real. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I parked the truck a little far away, not wanting her to see me right away. I walked in slowly, pretending I was only there to grab a coffee to go. I looked around, and there she was, sitting at the table with the guy. He spoke fast, pushed papers in her direction, maintained that posture leaning forward that manipulative people love to use to invade the other's space without seeming aggressive. And it was there, in that busy little coffee shop in Houston, that I understood something that weighed more than the phrase, "You're not my father." She wasn't rejecting me. She was looking for someone who would say exactly what she wanted to hear. And unfortunately, I was the only one in her life willing to say what she needed to hear. When I approached, he noticed before her. He raised an eyebrow, with a smile that I'd already seen in many executives trying to disguise fear. I sat next to her without asking permission. She was startled, he was uncomfortable. And before she could kick me out again, I put my phone on the table with the report open. "If you're going to sign this, it's good to know who you're dealing with first." And in that instant, I saw her face change. Not by me, but for the first time, she saw the truth before pride. The silence that took over the table at that moment was no ordinary silence. It was that kind of heavy silence, which makes the air dense, which forces everyone to face reality without a filter. She looked at her phone, then at me, then at the mentor, and for the first time since the beginning of that story, I saw doubt in her eyes. It was not fear. It was a beginning of lucidity, but the man in front of her wasn't ready to let that happen. Het tried to regain control immediately, as every handler does when he feels the ground collapse underfoot. "That's a misunderstanding," he said, pushing the report aside. "Misunderstanding?" I replied, still in a calm voice. "So can you explain why your last company went bankrupt in 6 months? Or why did you open another one in Arizona and closed before you even hired someone?" She looked away from him, waiting for an answer. He smiled, but the smile was crooked. The security he had displayed minutes earlier began to crack. He said that these were bureaucratic issues, that entrepreneurship involved risks, that innovation bothered a lot of people. Recycled phrases typical of those who run away from the central point. I kept looking without interrupting, and that was precisely what made him uncomfortable. She took a deep breath, and then he looked directly at me. There was something there that I hadn't seen in a long time, something between recognition and regret. But before she could speak, the handler leaned toward her as if to pull her back into the crumbling bubble. "Don't let him intimidate you," he whispered, but loud enough for me to hear. "You're an adult. You decide your life." She widened her eyes for a second. I knew what she was thinking. This sounds exactly like the speech I repeated to her as a child, only distorted, used as a weapon by someone who wanted something from her. And that perhaps has had more effect than any document. I leaned forward and said softly, "Adult, yes. Naive. It doesn't have to be." The man tried to grab the papers before she touched them again, but she put her hand on the contract first. Not to sign, but to drive them away. I saw his fingers tremble. I saw pride fighting against reason, impulse fighting against common sense. She stood there staring at her own fingers as if trying to understand herself. And then what I knew would happen sooner or later happened. She finally saw what was in front of her. Not because I said so, not because I forced it, but because for the first time, the narrative of the mentor clashed head-on with real facts. She pulled the contract slowly, took a breath and asked, "Is this all true?" He tried to smile, but his expression sank. They are old documents, distorted things. This is no longer relevant. Yes, it does, I replied, because all of this here proves that you're not offering an opportunity. It is offering a trap. The cafeteria was full, but at that moment it seemed that the world had shrunk to just that table. The light from the window illuminated half of his face, leaving the other half in shadow. And I thought, that's exactly how these people work. Half promises, half darkness. He stood up, annoyed. She said that we were compromising a unique chance, that she was throwing gold away, that I was a controlling stepfather. But at that moment, she was no longer listening to him. Or rather, he was, but with new ears. She finally heard how he spoke to her. He saw the pressure, he saw the insolence, he saw the manipulation wide open. And then she said something that caught me off guard. Something simple, something that years ago would have made me cry. I want to read this calmly. With my stepfather. He froze for a second. Then he laughed. But that dull laugh betrayed defeat. He picked up the briefcase quickly, as if he wanted to escape his own reflection. And he left the coffee shop without looking back. When the door slammed, she stood there, quiet. And for the first time since her teenage years, we were two adults sitting side by side, not fighting over emotional territory. She fiddled with the straw of the plastic cup, stared at the table, and in a low voice said, I shouldn't have said that to you. I kept quiet, not because he wanted punishment, but because I wanted her to speak to the end, in her own way. I was angry, she continued. Angry with me, actually. Anger because I knew, deep down, that something was wrong. But I didn't want to admit it, so I threw it all at you. Those words entered me like an old wound being touched, but this time without pain, just with the feeling that it was finally healing. She put her hands on her face, shy, perhaps embarrassed. I knew you wanted to protect me, but I just wanted to feel like I owned myself. It took me a few seconds to speak, and you are. Being the owner of one's own life does not mean handing everything over to the first one who promises quick success. She nodded, wiping away something that didn't even turn into a tear. Thank you for coming here. I didn't come to stop you, I replied. I came to make sure you didn't lose everything before you realized who was on your side. She took a deep breath, and at that moment, for the first time since this story began, I felt that the "you're not my father" had finally fallen apart. Not because I demanded it, but because she herself realized that a father, whether biological or chosen, is the one who is still there even when he is hurt. She was quiet for a few seconds, looking at the table as if trying to rearrange her own head. The cafeteria was still full. The noise of people coming and going formed a distant background. But there, in that little bubble between the two of us, everything finally seemed in place. Not perfect nor resolved forever, but in the right place. That of the truth, not that of the fantasy that someone had placed before her. I expected her to say something, but I realized that the silence was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. It was a silence that wiped away the excess of pride, like a broom going through the emotional mess that contract had caused. She pulled out her cell phone, took a deep breath, and opened the conversation with the mentor. He stared at the screen for a few seconds, as if thinking about every word so as not to leave a gap for return. Then he typed slowly, firmly, I don't sign anything. I don't trust it anymore. Please don't look for me again. She deleted it, rewrote it, deleted it again, until he finally did. As soon as the message disappeared on the screen, her shoulder relaxed. It was as if he had lifted a real weight off his back. And for the first time, without looking at me, she muttered, You were right. It was not a phrase of defeat. It was a phrase of liberation. We left the cafeteria slowly. The sun was already lower, illuminating the sidewalks with that typical Houston golden hue in the late afternoon. We walked to the parking lot in silence, but it was another kind of silence, one that no longer hurt. When we got close to the truck, she stopped, stared at me and said, I know I hurt you, more than I should. And I also know that you didn't have to come after me, but it still came. She spoke as someone who finally understands the difference between presence and obligation, between someone who stays out of interest and someone who stays because they really care. I didn't come after you to win anything, I replied. I came because you deserve someone to tell the truth even when it hurts. She lowered her gaze, squeezing the strap of her purse. I'm not used to this, with someone else staying even when I push. That hit me. Maybe she had never had that security even before I came into her life. Maybe that "You're not my father," had a lot more to do with her fears than with me. And maybe in a way, that sentence was a request disguised as a test. "Will you leave if I hurt you?" I approached, put my hand on her shoulder, and said simply, "I'm not leaving because of a sentence." She bit her lip, trying to keep her composure. "I thought if I showed you I didn't need you, I would be stronger." "That's not what strength is," I replied. "Strength is knowing when someone is trying to knock you down and not falling." "You did it today." She laughed weakly, almost embarrassed. "I only got it because you showed up." We got into the truck, and during the drive home, she stared out the window, thoughtful. From time to time, he sighed, as if letting go of small accumulated fears. When we parked in the driveway, she held the handle but didn't get off. He turned to me and asked softly, "Why didn't you give up on me?" It was the central question of the whole story. The question she didn't have the courage to ask before because the answer might be too painful. But now she was ready. I took a deep breath and replied, "Because I've never been here to be called Dad. I was here to be someone who doesn't abandon you, and that doesn't depend on the title." She swallowed her emotion, just nodded, and finally got out of the car. We walked to the door of the house like two people who had been through a storm and were now stepping on firmer ground. Before entering, she stopped, turned to me, and said, in a shy way, as if returning something she had taken unintentionally, "Even so, thank you for being what a parent should be." It was not an apology. It was not a grandiose statement. It was true, simple, and direct, the way it needed to be. And at that moment I understood that sometimes the justice we expect does not happen in court, or in the registry office, or in confrontation. Sometimes justice happens in the conscience of someone who finally sees everything you've done when no one else was watching. And that evening, in silence, walking beside her, I knew that the phrase she used to hurt me had lost its power, because she understood something that took years to realize. Being a father is not a title. It is history written in silence. It is presence when the world tries to deceive. It is to stay when pride tries to separate. And that was the justice I expected.